Well, hello everyone, it's Kristi. Sorry that I am going early, but I am just really tired. I'm still recovering. I'm better, but I just couldn't. I just want to get going. So I know there's not going to be a lot of people in the chat, and sorry for those of you who wanted to see everything live, but I just wanted to get this out and be done and have an evening. So that's what I'm going to do and be super selfish. Oh, I'm going to do my lava lamp one. Right. Well, you already saw the title. Actually, I don't know why I'm even bother doing this, but we're going to talk. What I want to do today in terms of the philosophy of social science is to talk about that link between ontology of how we think things exist in the world, not in terms of like atoms and things, but in terms of social realities and people's lived experiences, the factors that shape that and influence it, and then how we go about actually investigating those things. If you've been with my channel for a while, one of the things that I was like, oh, I've got stuff in the background. Oh, it's just okay. It's socks. I have my old socks. I was like, what was that? Oh, it's my socks. Yeah, great. What that's not nothing you'd get at a university lecture normally, but when we think about what is in the world and we think, all right, we're going to have a research question investigates this phenomenon, then the question becomes, well, how do you investigate it? And the thing about social science or social studies is that we're all of them, whether it's experimental work, which is probably the closest you get to the natural sciences, used a lot in psychology, sometimes in political behavior, I think less in sociology because that's more aggregate. They work with survey data. But whether it's experimental stuff or survey data, which is how we do a lot of our social analysis, or qualitative research by looking at what people say or what they write or what they produce in terms of images, then all of that is empirically grounded. So there, in that way, the quants-qual divide isn't like an epistemological one, even if we have an ontologically different perspective. So in other words, you can be a foundationalist or an anti-foundationalist as a social scientist. You're still going to be empirical in your approach. You're still going to be looking at observation and the things that exist in the world. You're not going to be using rationalism, right, and trying to find deductive truths. So that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit before we go deeper into the qual stuff that we're going to discuss. So, oh, actually, this is an old. These are my old slides from Birkbeck, by the way, when I used to teach at the MRes. These are all available on academia.edu. They're a bit old now, but you know some of these things happily don't change a lot over time, so it's not so bad. Now which way am I looking? Oh, I think I have to swap this holder. Hold on. I think I have to move this over here, and me over here. No, not like that. Not like that. So that it looks like I'm looking at the thing I want to look at. Otherwise, I'm looking away from it. And I always just think that looks... No, right? I'm looking in this direction. No, I had it right the first time. See, this is why I shouldn't have gone live. I should have tested this stuff out before I went live. So, we will get there in the end. I promise, promise, promise. Otherwise, I can just ignore myself and get going. All right. Okay. Let's say we were interested in learning we're social researchers. We want to understand, why do people vote? If we were going to be looking at it from a more quantitative perspective, we would go out and we would have a theory, right, that says people who have more engagement, more cognitive mobilization in terms of what they read and their level of education, their engagement, these kinds of things, the more cognitively mobilized they are, the more likely they are to vote. And we think about this from a perspective that each influence on someone's life has almost like a causal mechanism the same way gravity does, right? That there are factors that are pushing people in certain directions, right? And it's on that assumption of the causality of the direction or the strength of that force that we're able to predict someone's behavior. Just like if you push something, you should be able to predict what direction it goes into if, you know, gravity's operating and there's no winds and the air surface is flat, right? So we treat each piece of information as its own sort of force in the world. And we want to isolate the influence of all of these individual forces. So we can represent this as a model, as a mathematical model. It's more abstract than filling in the numbers. So the way that these models work is you have a general model, and then if you wanted to know how someone scored. You could go into their data and like pull out all their individual scores and give them a final score. But generally in survey data, what we end up doing is just aggregating all of this in terms of, we look for the things that explain the most stuff about the most people. So if we were thinking about it from a very foundationalist, sort of like social forces exist in the world like natural forces, then we could operationalize cognitive mobilization as follows: that your likelihood to vote, which is going to be a probability of yes or no, right, will be some function of a constant of where the same rate for everyone who's going to vote, right? We control for the base rate of voting. And then you get a score for your education, how much media you consume, your interest in politics, how you do on a knowledge quiz, the extent of your dissatisfaction with the government's policy performance, and then your demographics as controls. So we treat each of these as like forces in the world, and we're trying to isolate them and give them specific scores. Or maybe they don't have an effect, in which case then we can go, okay, this doesn't really do anything. We can discount this as an explanatory factor. And that's how you think about social science from a quantitative point of view. You're trying to understand what are the influences, what are the forces at work. Now that can be an internal motivation, like people's attachment or cognitive engagement with something. It can be an external force, like where you live or how much you earn or what education you've attained. But at the end of the day, they're all kind of like things that we can measure, and they're operating and they're consistent in some way. Now, there are other ways that we model inconsistencies with things like interaction effects, and we can also look at structural equation models to understand things better. There's lots of fancy statistics that we can do to try to get at a deeper understanding or a more nuanced understanding, but the ontology doesn't change. Well, how we think things work doesn't change. And the thing about this approach is it kind of works. Like, does it always work? But it kind of works. Works often enough that we use it to predict, like there's polling being done all the time. Campaigns spend a lot of money on polling. Media outlets spend a lot of money on polling. And so we feel that there is, information and knowledge value that is produced by gathering this information. But just because we treat the world as if it operates in this way, where quantitative structures and constants, in an equation, and the idea that, like aging will have a sort of similar effect on everyone, just because we act as if that's how it works. And our models produce results as if it is like that. That doesn't mean it is like that, right? There's a little bit of I don't want to say a fiction, that's not it, but don't mistake the process, like don't mistake the method for the thing you're studying. Because you're kind of creating a structure. You're putting everything into these boxes of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're taking out the don't knows, and you're doing, like we as social scientists do a lot with the data to get it, cleaned up and ready for analysis. And there's nothing like underhanded about it, but all of it goes to kind of reinforce this mechanical view of the world, right? So if we compare that to qualitative research, that's quite different, because in this case, we're not trying to find a model that we can fit to a lot of data, and we're not trying to generalize yet to the whole world. We're trying to understand what people mean. Not necessarily like we talk about the quant side of what people do think or say, but there's also an attachment here in qualitative research to more normative things, to meaning, right? To the way values play into it, how things are framed. And you can measure framing in a quantitative way, but it's going to be a positive framing or a negative framing. And so you kind of measure it, but there's other things you can't measure. Qualitative research is oftentimes grounded in words. There are some, you can look at like campaign literature, again from the political science field, to look at how images are put together, for instance. But generally, qualitative research is either what people are saying or what they're writing. Its ontology is constructivist, so there isn't a phenomenon out there like independent of individuals that a qualitative researcher goes to look for. If I'm doing qualitative research, I'm going to go talk to people, because that's where the reality happens, is in people's actions, right? And Therefore, its epistemological position is more interpretivist. It's trying to make sense of the social world by examining how people themselves interpret it, as opposed to saying, here's the effect of age on you, right? Or saying, oh, well, what is it like to be aging? What does it feel like to get older, or what anxieties come up? Hello, motorized vehicles have come up. And it is far more likely to be inductive. So we're not going to take a generalized theory and test it out to see what we can show our theory to be wrong. That's the goal of theory testing, is to try to prove it wrong. And then, if it's not wrong, then the data will show you that, right? But it's deductive. Whereas qualitative research is looking for the things that we've missed, or it's looking for a subtlety that isn't captured in other ways. Or it's revisiting a question, but in a new setting. From the qualitative perspective, and for this you can read more about Burr, if knowledge doesn't come from the nature of the world as it really is, right, then where does it come from? Well, the answer of the social constructivist would be is that we construct our social world. And it doesn't mean that we have complete power over it. I mean, there's a lot of things I would change about the social world, but I don't have the power because I'm not recognized as a legitimate authority to change the laws. Right? I live within a system where only a certain group of people get to change the laws. And but that doesn't mean that my reality isn't constructed or isn't influenced in how I construct it based on the choices that I'm allowed to have by other people. Social interactions of all kinds, especially language ones, of interest. And at any one time, it's widely accepted. What is widely accepted, right, is from a constructivist position, not a product of objective observation, but of social processes and interactions between people. Now, I always like to give as the example the historical fact that for until the 1950s, I can't remember, whenever it was that Pluto was discovered, we had 8 planets. And then Pluto was discovered, and that fact changed. And until I was quite far along in my adulthood, Pluto was a planet. Then things changed, and Pluto wasn't a planet anymore. So was Pluto a planet because of objective observation? Or was Pluto not a planet, not a planet because of social processes and interactions between people? It's not saying that we made the planet, we made the dwarf star, or dwarf planet, whatever it is now, Pluto, but the category, the way we treated it, the way we viewed it, is a direct result of social processes and interactions between people, not the rock. That happened between us. So, there's somebody, hello? Technical issues? I hope you can all hear me. I'm just going to go. If there's a problem, I'll just come back to it. Anyway, hello. Okay, let's see. Doesn't look like it from my side. All right, constructions, qualitative perspectives. Yes, the constructions of the world sustain patterns of social actions. They also exclude others, like I was saying, about who gets to make laws, and include other people. Another thing that is just part and parcel, although maybe not clarified enough or pointed to enough, is that constructions of the world are bound up with power relations. So it's not just that we make up a kind of a little handshake or whatever, right? That's a social interaction to smooth things along. But social interactions are patriarchy, they are systems of government, they are various other restrictions we might, economic restrictions we might be born into. And so social construction is, I think, you can say, naturally a place of power contestation, because because it's about regulating human behavior. The social construction of our reality ultimately is about organizing our society and controlling human relations, and that involves power. So you can't kind of get away from it. And Michel Foucault mentioned the way that people talk and think about things in society have implications for how we treat others, and our representations entail certain types of power relations. And I'm not saying that quants doesn't really get into that, but I think that because of the way that they look, because from a quantitative perspective, you sort of you'll think about racism, but racism will be like a category over here. Then you got sexism, and there's these neat kind of categories. Whereas on a constructivist perspective, these are all commingling at the same time. Right. I think I'm getting okay. I'll go a little bit into this since we've got it on the slides, but it's getting a little farther away from what I wanted to do. But so as a qualitative researcher, what might I be interested in? How might I go about investigating things in the social world? Well, I would be interested in understanding how people construct their accounts of events. Because in this process of constructing the story of your life, you're constructing your identity. Or you're constructing a version of your identity that you want to present to the world. And I'm not saying that if someone gives you something, you have to accept it at face value. You can understand that people have motivations and reasons for they want to do it. But their choice of words, the way that they present themselves, all of this is going to indicate to you, like, how they construct their identity, their value system, how they relate to things. As a qualitative researcher, you might be interested to investigate how speech acts. Theory draws attention to language as functional and not descriptive, but performative. Language isn't something that we use to talk about a microphone here, or I'm giving you information out of my mouth and that you're listening to, but language itself has power. That there are certain words and phrases that we've agreed carry a weight, and that people will obey these things, obey your commands or follow through with your orders if you are the right person in the right position to, and you say the right things, that you can then actually, language is an exercise of power. An example of that would be, you're grounded. Like probably your first example of that growing up might have been you're grounded. That is speech act theory. That is language as function, not just as description. Or I sentence you to 6 months. It's not the piece of paper, it's the declaration backed up by the paper, but it's the declaration that carries the weight, the power behind it. And interpretive repertoire can examine linguistic resources that people draw upon when constructing their accounts. Media effects. Media effects is a well-known phenomenon that if you ask people, what are you most concerned about in politics, they will most likely cast their mind back to something they noticed in the news that they cared about. And they'll talk about whatever that recent news story was. Maybe they have a separate one, right? But you can kind of maybe understand, you may hear echoes of the Daily Mail in the way they frame things, right? You're like, oh, okay, I know where they're getting their information from, or at least what they're open to. And that, of course, gives you an insight into like the identities they built and how they understand the world. You hear a lot about surveys, polls, even psychological experiments, and you're probably familiar with focus groups and interviews. Of course, those are pretty common when it comes to doing, qualitative research. But another way that you could go about doing qualitative research is ethnographic, and that is when the researcher immerses themselves in the environment of the people that they want to study. And in this environment, it's a little bit anthropological, if you want to think about it in that way. And they're like Jane Goodall and the chimps or whatever. You're like, you get in there. So an example would be, let's say you're interested in understanding power dynamics in a political campaign. So you would go and basically volunteer or be an intern. Or because you kind of have to, if you want to get, you have to get some experience in what they're doing. So if it's not a political campaign, let's say it's a nonprofit group. And you go and you watch. First you don't sneak in. It's not investigative journalism, but you get permission. You understand. You let everyone know what your study's about. That you're going to be observing them, watching them. You might want to be able to look at some of the memos that they circulate, and attend some of their meetings, see the minutes afterwards, look at what they produce as a group to try to get their message out, and then you might also interview the staff. What are their motivations? Why do they do this work? Or what do they like about it? You might look at how power is exercised in the office. And so the idea is to not just rely on individual accounts, but really immerse yourself into the environment and try to get a ground eye view of what people are doing. And if you think that people would act differently when they're being observed, yine. Yeah, initially they do, but eventually it doesn't take long for people to forget that they're being recorded or forget that they're being interviewed, and they just start talking, which is kind of what you want anyway, because when people are very aware of what they're if they're being recorded, then they get kind of more self-conscious and self-censoring, which, I get, but at the end of the day, you do want them to give a more honest account because that's sort of what you're after. Not to give away secrets, just to like chill a bit. And we already talked about interviews, focus groups, and yeah, I think here at this point, a little bit more, I guess I'll say, an analysis of text and documents, which can also be called content analysis. Here you're going to be looking through a piece of writing. Let's say it's a literature piece put out by this nonprofit group that you're doing this non-existent ethnographical study for. You might want to go through their literature or their flyers and look, what is the most frequent word or phrase that comes up? Because the thing that they repeat the most is going to be like can give you an indication of what their priorities are. You can also, for other documents, look at the settings. You can look at how things are framed. And when you analyze discourse and conversational analysis, this is getting quite deep here into the weeds. I did a little bit of this over the course of my research when I did my analysis of how people build stories about their election day experiences. But here the idea is, you're trying to understand. We know people communicate in stories. Like basically this whole lecture is kind of a story. I'm going to have a beginning, we're going to have a here, I'm going to end. And there's like little mini stories inside in between. And by looking at what people start their stories with, where they put the tension in the story, where they put the resolution, do they have a coda where they kind of wrap it all up and get back to their main theme? You can see kind of some interesting patterns in how people structure these types of things. At least I did for my research. Yeah, so to just compare, again, we go back to the quantitative. You have a theory. It says ask a question. And here is you have a theory, or you have a question, you do some research, you get a theory. From your theory, you draw out a hypothesis. You test it with an experiment or survey data. You analyze, you don't just test it with an experiment. You would, in the case of quants, you would want to falsify your theory, or attempt to falsify your theory with data. And hopefully, we'll see if the null hypothesis gets rejected. Then you draw your conclusions. A hypothesis can be true, or it can be partially true or false. You have sort of like 3 options in that. Because you might be partly right. So if you're partly right, you're not 100% wrong. So we would say partially true. And then, if you find out your theory did a good job predicting things, you report your results. And then even if it's true, you can think about other ways to use it. So I know that this is false or partially true. Think again. Just because your hypothesis, your theory is held up once doesn't mean it couldn't be challenged in another setting. So that's a very you do this structure to quants. Qual is quite similar. You can ask a question, you do research background into the literature. You can, in this case, you don't have a theory. So you would then say, who are the people I need to talk to learn more about this? And you would find your subjects ideally and talk to them, get permission, talk to them, collect your data. And then you get a whole bunch of raw data. And qual people, we don't have fancy statistical packages that the quants people have, right? They have to do some serious data cleaning, missing answers or things that are wrongly coded or outliers or whatever, make sure that it's actually clean data. But then you can just go run here, you do the research, you get the question, you collect the data, and then you start. And you dig in and you read. And you think, and you read, and you think, and you read, and you look for patterns, you look for again, words or phrases that come up often again, or if you find something surprising and you do some conceptual work, you're okay, I'm seeing X, Y, and Z, and then you go out and you talk to more people and you collect more data. You're okay, all right. So, and then the question becomes a bit more refined. Maybe you're developing, different categories of new subjects, whatever it is, and, you keep going in collecting more data until what you reach is it's called theoretical saturation. And that means you're talking to new people and you're not getting anything new. Everything you've heard is something somebody's already said, and so your theory is covered. And I can tell you after 14 focus groups, by focus group 14, I've reached theoretical saturation. There's nothing around the table really that is, oh my gosh, no one's ever said that before. When you talk to 70 people or 120 people, you can get to theoretical saturation. So what do quants and qual have in common then, in terms of their approaches and the way they look at the world? Well, as I mentioned, they're both empirical. Both require and rely upon observations. In quantitative, we use survey questions as ways to measure beliefs, attitudes, opinions, or behaviors. And in qualitative, the experience of the setting, participant observation, analysis of conversation, meaning and context, it's still based on observation and collecting data. Both quants and qual are problem-focused. Quantitative methods are driven by a well-formed research question designed to test potential causal mechanisms. And in quants can also be used to investigate. I think that's a typo for me. I think this should be qualitative. To investigate well-formed research questions into social phenomenon. Do men and women use gendered frameworks when evaluating party leaders? That should be qualitative here. That was a typo on my part. They have, in terms of hypothesis testing, qualitative research can't do a pure hypothesis testing. However, you can do a speculation of, like we would expect, based on previous research, we would expect to see, and then kind of, so for instance, on this question, do men and women use gendered frameworks when evaluating party leaders? That was the question we went into and ran six focus groups on, I think, for amongst other questions. And what we did was we asked people, we showed a picture of a party leader. We said, first, silently brainstorm, like what words come to mind. And I think we had to indicate like positive, negatives, or which ones were most important. And then we went around the table and had people discuss them. And then more kind of came out through the course of the conversation. And then we took on them, took everyone's answers and we put them in a big list. And we coded which ones were said by women and which ones were said by men. And we looked to see if there were patterns, just like do something really sexist, like, the women were saying, oh, he's really hot, like I don't really know his policies, but or something, like they weren't, obviously. And when we looked for that evidence from 6 focus groups, I think of like 8 to 10 people in each focus group, evenly divided in a binary, because it's 2010 or 2007, and I was like still in the cis bubble at that point, the cis normative bubble. Then we couldn't find any, like we saw no kind of pattern emerged, nothing we could point to that's like, yeah, this is one thing women say that men don't, and one thing that men say that women don't. So it's not the kind of it's not hypothesis testing in the falsification sense. It's I'm formulating and I'm based on what the theory predicts. I'm going to do a well-educated guess and see whether or not this result emerges from the data or not. And then you can look at different perspectives. There are people who think that quants should be used more and qual should be like used to improve quants, doing cognitive interviewing or illustrating quantitative finding through qualitative findings, or the superiority of qual over quants, although that's much less common. But at the end of the day, I am not a qual over quants or quants over qual. I am purely mixed methods, which means whatever question I want to answer, I want the method that's best suited to answer that question. And sometimes you can answer a question from a quants and a qual perspective, and that's great. then if you could do experiment and find similar things, you'd have it from a survey method, an experimental method, and a qual method. Then you've kind of like covered all your bases that this phenomenon is a thing. So, all right, I wanted to get all. Okay, cool. All right, good. I'm glad that you could hear me after I sorted all my stuff out. And yeah, sorry that I was late on Sunday. I ended up taking a sick day yesterday. I just had a rough weekend, and today too. I was fading by 4 o'clock. So I came home, had a little bit of power nap, and then wanted to jump on and do this for you guys. And tomorrow I'm off to Frankfurt for a little thingy, so it's going to be an early night for me. But again, thank you for your patience with me. Thank you for waiting for my amateurs sort out the Kristi, sort out the screen, like where you're looking live show fun that I do love to provide. So yeah, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna have some water. You can see here. I'm gonna chill out. I'm gonna get some sleep, and I'll see everybody else on Sunday. If you want, oh no, I'm not. I'm gonna say there's stuff in the Discord. There's probably nothing like the Discord link. So I'll try to get on that next Sunday. Yeah, I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Be happy, be well, be safe, wherever it is, whenever it is you are. Yes, and Magica, very informative. Just saying, nerd. Homer Simpson shout, absolutely. Yeah, stick around, come back for more lessons. That's what I love to do. I'm your social science geek here on YouTube. All right. Until next time.